الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear students, I welcome you all to another session of video lectures of Afghanistan economy. I hope everybody is fine and doing great. Inshallah, in our today's lecture, we'll have discussion on fiscal policy of Afghanistan. Besides this lecture, we'll have some other topics to be discussed here in this lecture, and those are going to be a general discussion on fiscal policy, then a specific discussion on fiscal policy of Afghanistan, then we'll have discussion on what changes are required in the fiscal policy of Afghanistan. We'll have some discussion on the extra concepts, including fiscal policy itself, on budget and off budget. There'll be discussion on some other concepts as well. So let's start with the first, fiscal policy. What is fiscal policy? The definition of fiscal policy is basically the use of government collection, which is taxation, and expenditures, which is spending, to influence the macroeconomy of the country. So fiscal policy basically is a policy which outlines what should be done in order to generate the revenue or do collection, which is taxation for the government, in how wisely spend them, or how wisely spend them on the macroeconomy of the country in order to bring the macroeconomic development. So in this policy, there are two pillars or two sides of this policy, and this policy is one of the key policies made by the governments, right? So fiscal policy ensures macroeconomic development in a country. That's why fiscal policy is one of the important policies made by the government, which talks about the revenue collection, and then spending of those revenues on the economy to bring development. So in fiscal policy, basically it is discussed, or it is decided, or it is planned how government is going to collect taxes, and then how those collections or those revenues should be spent in various sectors in the economy to ensure macroeconomic development, right? So one of the key factors of the fiscal policy is budget. So then each government has its own budget department, or which is called Directorate of Budget, or maybe by other names. So basically there are two sides of the fiscal policy. The first side is collection, or the income, which is taxes or taxation, and the second side is expenditure, or the expenses of the government, which we call them spending. So it is decided how to collect taxes or income, generate the revenues, and also where to spend and how to spend. So this basically is a foolproof plan made by a government in order to wisely collect the revenues and then wisely spend those revenues to bring macroeconomic development. So let's have further discussion on the fiscal policy. Here are some extra information. Fiscal policy refers to use of government spending and tax policies to influence economic conditions, especially macroeconomic conditions, including aggregate demand for goods and services, employment, inflation, and economic growth. Earlier I said macroeconomic development. What is macroeconomic development? There are 4 things or 5 things in the macroeconomic development. The first thing is aggregate demand for goods and services. It means that people should have sufficient money for goods and services, and government should spend money to to develop a demand for goods and services. And no matter what it takes, there should be policy, there should be plans made in order to make people able to have demand for goods and services. So this is a very great, vast discussion. There are a lot of other factors involved in this term when we say generating aggregate demand for goods and services. Employment is another factor of the macroeconomic development. So what a government should also keep in mind, should spend its money wisely, in a way that it generates employment in various sectors of the economy. Also, the other thing is inflation. Inflation should be controlled. Government should not left inflation to lead to the deflation or hyperinflation. So all these, there should be inflation, but it should be in controlled way, not more and not less. And other economic development. Economic growth here means the business, commerce and trade. There should be exports and imports. Government should, while making the policy, should keep in mind that where to spend its money in a way that should ensure economic growth in a country. So fiscal policy is the means by which it's a tool, right? We can say that it's a tool by which governments adjust its spending levels and tax rates to monitor and influence national economy. With the help of fiscal policy, government adjusts its tax rate. Sometimes taxes are increased and sometimes taxes are decreased. Sometimes there is tax waiver. So depending upon the need and demand of a strategy in a country, fiscal policy is adjusted. It is the sister strategy to monetary policy. Monetary policy is one of the other important strategies or plans or policies of the country through which a central bank influences a nation's money supply. Look, fiscal policy, who is authorized to make fiscal policy? In Afghanistan, it's Ministry of Finance, and then within Ministry of Finance there is Directorate of Budget. So basically they are responsible for making monetary policy, and being tax authority, they do everything is fiscal policy. When it comes to monetary policy, it's the Central Bank of Afghanistan, which is called the Afghanistan Bank. The Afghanistan Bank is basically responsible for making the monetary policy. With the help of monetary policy, they control money supply of our country. So using a mix of monetary and fiscal policies, governments can control economic phenomenon, right? So these are two basic or most important policies made by the country in order to bring economic development, economic growth, generate employment, control inflation, and also create a demand for goods and services, and control the money supply, right? So this is about the fiscal policy. Hope it's understood. Now, I said there are two sides of fiscal policy. Number one is with the help of fiscal policy, we control our income, and on the other side, we control our expenditures. The most important tool or factor of the fiscal policy of any country is the budget. What is the budget? Budget is basically all the income generated by a country and all the expenses which are going to be made by the country, right? Usually the budgets are made for year by year, and there are countries who made the budgets for 5 years. So usually it's 1 year to another year, right? This budget is then passed through the parliament and to the Senate, and then approved by the president of a country, right? So when budget is approved according to the budget, ministries are given the funds to be spent in the sector that they are responsible to. So that's how it goes with the monetary policy. With the fiscal policy. Sometimes when we make fiscal policy, we see that we have budget deficit, and sometimes there are budget surpluses. What is budget deficit? Budget deficit is that when we have more spendings than what was planned. For example, we have a fund of, for example, $5 million in our budget. When we spend according to the plan, we go negative. Means all the money that we had is spent, and there is still a need of money to be spent in order to reach to our goals. So we are lag behind. We don't have the money. This is called budget deficit, right? And budget surplus. What is budget surplus? Budget surplus is when we have more than sufficient money in our budget, which is left over, which is not spent. For example, we have planned that $10 million are going to be spent in a certain ministry, but the ministry is not able to spend that money wisely as required or as needed, and by the end of the year there is extra money remaining with them. This is called budget surplus. Same is the case with the country. Some countries, while they are making budget, they plan everything, but at the end of the day, at the end of the year, at the end of the period, they see that they have no money left, and they still money is needed to be spent. So they face budget deficit. And there are countries when while they make budget, and by the end of the day, when they see they have extra amounts remaining and they have all achieved their own goals, but still they have extra money remaining in their budget, so we call that budget surplus. What are the causes for budget deficit and budget surplus? Well, the main reason could be improper planning or no control over spending. When we do not spend wisely and uselessly, usually it leads to budget deficit. What is budget surplus? There are two causes. One is when we control everything and we wisely spend money, we could have budget surplus. But sometimes we are not able to spend the money as it is required, and we are not able to achieve our objectives. When we are not able to achieve our objectives, so we have not spent the money. When the money is not spent, it means the money is remaining with us, so that leads to budget surplus. So budget surplus has two sides, positive side and negative side. So when we have budget deficit, what should be done? We can fulfill the budget deficit, extra money needed, by borrowing from other countries or maybe from other organizations, international organizations. Or if we not see it feasible to borrow money from the international organizations. For example, these days, if you remember, Afghanistan is planning to borrow money from IMF in order to fight with Corona, which is not accepted by the parliament and by most of the people in Afghanistan. But government is facing budget deficit, and that's the reason that they want to borrow money. But if a country thinks that borrowing is not feasible for them because the expense is more on the borrowing, they can issue bonds. What is bond? The finance guys should have already information on bonds. Bond is basically a security, a financial security, which has a par or a face value issued by the country to maybe organizations, to maybe the banks, and to maybe some businessmen. When they borrow the bonds, the government pay the bondholder interest, and at the end of the period, the capital money is returned to him. So that's a kind of like borrowing thing, but with the help of a security. If again government thinks that issuing bond is not feasible, cannot happen, they can go for foreign aids, and they can apply for aids. And aid is a free money, but there is a problem with aid. Some aids are bound, so you cannot spend them in a way that they should be spent. So the donor agencies mainly have control over the aids, and you have to spend them in a sector, in a place where their objectives are achieved. So these are three things with the help of which budget deficits could be fulfilled, right? Now, fiscal policy is a key instrument of macroeconomic stability. If a country wants to bring macroeconomic stability, overall economic stability in a country, they need to focus on the fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the key instrument or tool with the help of which we can bring stability in the economy. So budget is one of its important tool, right? Smart fiscal policy can support strong economic growth. When we want to have a strong economic growth, we have to focus on our fiscal policy. With the help of strong fiscal policy, it's possible to have a strong economic growth. Proper budget allocations. So in order to have good budget, we have to properly allocate funds. So when we have proper allocation, it brings reconstructions of the basic infrastructure in the country. There are 5 basic infrastructures that a country could have: railways, roads, we can say transportation. In transportation there are 3 things: railways and airways and seaways, right? Then we have power, energy and power, which is solar energy, water energy, and electricity, all those things, dams, etc. Then we have school education, we have health, and we have communication. These are 5 pillars of infrastructure of a country. So with the help of proper allocation of budgets, economic efficiency could be brought. It enhances the population standard of living. With proper economic development or good economic fiscal policy and good allocation of budgets, we can bring a good living standard to a country's population. So every government tries to increase its revenue by improving revenue administration, by enforcement and broadening of the tax base. Afghanistan is also trying to do that. In order to administer the revenues, a new law is passed last year. It's called tax administration law. With the help of tax administration law, government is they are improving revenue generation, and in order to enforce the tax basis, they have a law which is called income tax law. In order to properly the income tax law be implemented, they have started programs like Tax Week, and also they have seminars in all different provinces. Before, there were 5 or 6 main provinces from where government used to generate the revenue. Now this has been enhanced to all the provinces, and they have started communicating this with the help of seminars, with the help of events, and now all Afghans, the Ministry of Finance are trying to communicate with all the Afghans and try to encourage the tax culture in the country, with the help of which will be standing on our feet. Remember that these foreign aids and borrowings, they are not good for the development of the country, because they could not. There is a strong possibility that these funds could not be managed properly, which lead to the further devastation and economic backwardness. So in order to be able to stand on feet and grow solidly, we need to focus on internal revenue, which is basically the tax. Okay, there are 4 macroeconomic goals with the help of fiscal policy we can achieve. The first one is economic growth, the second one is unemployment, the third one is inflation, and the fourth one is balance of trade. So with the help of fiscal policy, we can improve long-term investments in physical and human capital and technology in the country. Government borrowing and saving are linked. Whatever is borrowed, we have to make sure the money borrowed is spent wisely, which could bring sufficient savings, which could not only pay back but also have savings for the country, extra savings which could be spent in the upcoming budgets. Low employment, redesigning the tax policy, redesigning the spending programs. With the help of redesigning the tax policies and redesigning the spending programs, we can bring unemployment to its end. We can spend the money in a sector which could generate, for example, employment. So that one of the most important sectors in Afghanistan, which requires investment, is the agriculture sector. When we invest in agriculture sector, it will not only improve the possibilities of employment, not only in, for example, farmer, but also it can be linked with the engineering, with the technology, with the technical side as well. Because the agriculture requires machineries, and machinery comes with the help of engineers. So auto engineer and mechanical engineer, technical engineer, different types of engineering programs could be established, and with the help of that we could bring human capital in this sector. Even we can, with the help of agriculture sector, we can improve our medical sector as well, because all these agriculture sectors, they require medicines and different types of things which could help improve agriculture sector. So when we say agriculture sector, it's not only farming, it's beyond that. So as per my understanding, and of most of the people's understanding, we have to spend on agriculture if you want to improve economically. The third goal that we can be achieved with the help of fiscal policy is reducing the inflation. We can reduce inflation through spending cuts and increase in taxes. On one side, we can cut the expenses of the government. On the other side, we can increase the tax rates. With the help of it, we can control the inflation in the market of the country. Sustainable balance of trade. Balance of trade is one of the most important factors of macroeconomic stability. If there is no balance of trade, or if the balance of trade is deficit, so it is an indication of a weak economy and economic instability. Now, what is balance of trade? Balance of trade is basically an account of exports and imports, right? Balance of trade is deficit when there are more exports than imports, when there are more imports than exports, and balance of trade is surplus when we have more exports and less imports, right? So we, not only us, but all the countries, they try to have balance of trade as surplus, means they should have more exports than imports. When we have more exports, money is coming into the country, and our commodities and things are sold outside the country. And when we have less imports, it means that we are self-sufficient. We have a lot of industries, we have a lot of companies which are producing goods and services within the country. Therefore, there is no a necessity for the things to be brought in from outside the world. So with the help of fiscal policy, we can achieve these four goals, which are basically the key factors for macroeconomic development. Now let's talk about the fiscal policy of Afghanistan. Fiscal policy of Afghanistan is trying to ensure macroeconomic stability, but it is very fragile. Still, there is a requirement of more improvement in our fiscal policy. Our fiscal policy is not as effective as it should be, right? It's fragile. There are still a lot of reforms required to be brought in. Most of the reforms were brought in our fiscal policy with the help of IMF and UN Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals. These two goals, basically, the United Nations have two types of goals which are given to a country when they want to become the part of United Nations. The first one is Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, and the second one is Millennium Development Goals. The basic purpose of these goals is to bring poverty to the end and also bring economic growth in a country with the help of poverty reduction programs and growth facility programs. So they basically support two types of programs. One is poverty reduction and the second one is growth facility programs, right? Our fiscal policy is not fully fit for international framework. It's because of donor dependency. Like, most of our budget is depending on donors. Most of the money which comes into our budget is from the donors. So that's why we are not able to spend that wisely or as it is required, right? There is complicated expenditure prioritization. We cannot prioritize our expenses, our expenditures. Wherever an expense is required to be made, we sometimes are not able to spend there. We spend according to the donor agencies' need and demand. That's why our fiscal policy is fragile and cannot achieve those four goals as effectively as it could or as it should be. Our fiscal policy is not coordinated basically with the national budget process, right? In other countries, national budget process and fiscal policies, they have a strong coordination between them, but our fiscal policy is not coordinated with the national budget process. It's because of off the budget things. Off the budget things are off the budget basically means all those money over which we have less control, right? Basically the money coming from the aids. And on the budget things are those money which we have control over it, and that is our internal revenue. So let's have a discussion on these two concepts as an extra information. In Afghanistan, any aid assistance that are spent outside the national budget are coordinated off the budget assistance or considered aid as off the budget assistance. In other words, assistance provided by a donor or implementing agency that bypasses the core national budget and over which the government has no control or less control is considered off the budget assistance. As I earlier mentioned, that off the budget is the money which is basically an aid by a donor agency, by an aiding agency over which we have less control and has no coordination with the national budget process, is not spent wherever it should be spent as a government. And on the budget things are those money which is inside the national budget process and is not from the donor or implementing agency, which has a coordination with the core national budget and over which we have control. The government has control on its where to spend and how to spend, right? So that is the biggest problem with our fiscal policy, and due to which our fiscal policy is not fit for the international framework sustainability, and also cannot achieve those four macroeconomic goals as well, right? So the government expenditure policy focuses on private sector development in Afghanistan, enhancing production capacity, improving quality of life, of the population. So basically these are three main areas where in the fiscal policy government expenditures are focused. The government's budget allocation focuses on physical infrastructure, enhance human capital, increase employment opportunities. So earlier I mentioned that budget is one of the key tools of the fiscal policy. If you look at these two things, fiscal policy is focusing on one thing and budget allocations are focusing on something else. So that's why there is no coordination between the fiscal policy and the national budget process. Look, government fiscal policy expenditure focuses on private sector development, production, enhancing production capacity, improving quality of life of the population, whereas the budget process allocation focuses on the physical infrastructure, human capital, and employment opportunities, right? So that's the main reason where the fiscal policy cannot achieve four fiscal policy macroeconomic objectives. So there are few key challenges to Afghanistan fiscal policy. Number one is integration of external budget to the core budget. External budget and core budget, like they are same as off the budget and on the budget things. Improvement of the absorption of capacity in the ministry. Ministries basically they don't have the capacity to absorb the improvements which are required. For example, a ministry is given a fund and is given a plan to spend those funds according to the plan, but they are not able to spend them. They don't have the capacity. There is lack of human capital, there is lack of planning, there is lack of leadership. So that's why there are budget surplus most of the times. Improvement of weak reporting to the government. And the other big challenge is weak reporting. Sometimes, look, fiscal policy requires information, but the information based on which the fiscal policy is made, there are strong policies that due to weak reporting, that information is not reliable. So even due to that, our fiscal policy is not strong and not able to achieve macroeconomic development goals. In our fiscal policy, most of the finance debts are fulfilled through external grants and small borrowings. And there are medium-term fiscal policy objectives as well, which covers expenditures with domestic revenue. Revenue expenditure should be covered by sustainable resources. Public spending in Afghanistan is about 90% by grants and loans from foreign governments and institutions. Foreign aid, single most important source of revenue in Afghanistan is foreign aid, and it does not flow through the government channels. And that's why I earlier mentioned that despite the fact that a lot of money is coming into Afghanistan, but it's not improving, it's not growing, we cannot see that economic growth. It's due to the fact that foreign aids does not flow through government channels. Government has less control over them, and they are not spent where they should be spent. That's why we cannot achieve those objectives. Income tax and salary tax are not yet reliable sources of income. Government heavily relies on custom duties and trade taxes, right? So most of the government revenue is from tax, which is income tax and salary tax, sales tax. Besides these two, we have customs and trade taxes, with the help of which government is generating their revenue. But still, most of these income is coming from five main provinces, which has a border with other countries, where we have a trade channel with other countries. The share of operating expenses should decrease and that of development should increase. Okay, now we discuss what are required, right? What should be done to get Afghanistan's fiscal policy improved. The first thing is that the share of operating expenses should decrease and the share of development expenditures should increase. In Afghanistan, we have more operating expenses than the development expenses, right? That's why the economy is not improving and there is less development in the country. The operating budget has improved from a deficit of 4.4% in 1386 to a balanced budget in 1391. Cumulative total public expenditure, which is roads, energy, water, irrigation, airports and technology for 1387 to 91 was about $11 billion, which is 1/3 of the total expenditures, right? So like we have to expend more on public expenditures. These are developmental expenditures, but you see it's only 1/3 of the total expenditures. The other remaining part of the money is spent on the operating side of the country, not the development side. In Afghanistan fiscal policy, there have been key public finance management reforms. The first one is midterm budget framework, and the second one is program in provincial budgeting. So these two has brought a tremendous changes in the fiscal policy and helped the fiscal policy to at least achieve the objectives somehow. What changes are required or should be brought in with fiscal policy? Number one is provide more resources to the needy institutions, avoid spending beyond national absorption capacity. It's a fact that sometimes a ministry is given more funds than it is needed by them, and there is another ministry which required more funds but is given less funds, and that's why they face with budget deficits and budget surplus, and the money is not spent widely. Most of the money is spent on operating side, not on development side. The expenditures of government should not be based on availability of the revenues. It should be consistent with achieving long-term fiscal objectives. Measures should be developed for better managing the potential aid. A deposit buffer should be maintained at the central bank, which helps aid shortfalls. The revised fiscal policy suggestions are accommodating high security spendings, preserving pro-poor public spending, improve the development outlays. The financial management of ministries should be developed. Most of the ministries, they do not know how to manage their finances. There is not proper financial manager over there. So it's one of the other problems which ministries have, and government should focus on this as well. They should introduce a capable person so he or she can better manage the finances of that ministry. Income tax law should be amended, which has happened recently. The cost of doing business should be brought down, which government is focusing on and has brought to maximum level. The investment environment should be improved, which is yet to be done, and this is tied with the peace and security. Whenever there is 100% peace and security in the country, we can have a good investment environment in the country. Afghanistan national accounts. It collapsed administrative reporting system. We lost statistical data, currently in recovery process. In 1977, material product system was introduced to the country in order to manage all the information of the country with regards to all the things. But by 1999 and 95 we did not have any system with the help of which a country's planning could be done, a system which would provide information according to which, based on which a country should plan its future. By 2002, a system called the System of National Accounts, SNA, was started from scratch. In 2002 and 2003 is the base year for that system. Whenever the system provides us information, so we take this year as a base year, and then based on that we compare the information, and then we say that the country is developing, then GDP is improved, the GDP is deproved. So all this decision is made based on the base year, and the information is provided by the SNA system. Afghanistan's fiscal year starts from the 1st January to the 31st December of the year, but it was after 1390. Before 1390, the fiscal year was a bit different. It was first Hamal till Akhiri, till the end of the Hut, which is the 1st April till 21st April till the 30th till the 50th January, March of the year. But now it has been changed. It's basically 21st December of the previous year till the 20th December of the current year. We can also, like with 10 days of difference, we can say 1st January, 31st December. And we have a strategy which is called Afghanistan National Development Strategy. There should be a strong communication or coordination between the SNA system of national accounts, and with the Afghanistan National Development Strategy, because this is development strategy which requires information, and this information comes from the system called SNA. So there should be a strong coordination between these two, right? So this was all about the third lecture that we have, Afghanistan fiscal policy. Hope you understood it and you have learned something from it, and thank you very much for being with me. Please come back to me if you have any questions, any recommendations, and any suggestions. Thank you so much. Bye.